first is gluttony, and the contrary virtue is abstinence. And then secondly, lust, and then the virtue is chastity. And then finally, I want to talk about anger, and then clemency would be its remedy. The first is gluttony. And gluttony everyone knows, right? It's the desire for pleasures of eating. Or St. Thomas says, gluttony is when the desire for the pleasures of the table are excessively indulged. Now, in the whole range of vices, gluttony isn't the worst, but we often feel like really shameful when we are gluttonous. So we feel ashamed by it, but although it's not the worst. St. Thomas is very systematic, St. Thomas Aquinas. So he lists 5 different types of gluttony. So this is fun, I'm going to go through them, all right? In our mind, gluttony is just eating too much, and that's true. That's one of the ways of gluttony. But in other ways, gluttony is actually being over fussy about the quality of the food, being over fussy about how the food is prepared, eating too much, of course, eating at inappropriate times. So, for instance, like you just can't wait to eat, so you eat, I don't know, you eat your dinner too early, or you eat your dessert before dinner, or something like that. And then the final version of gluttony is to eat too ravenously. St. Thomas uses the Latin word ardente, right, which is like kind of a burning. So sometimes people, just are over-involved in their food. Okay, so that's different types of gluttony. And then St. Thomas talks about offspring of gluttony. So and this is true of a lot of the vices, especially the capital vices. You hear about the capital vices, right? Like pride, envy, lust, gluttony, these things. And they're not always mortal sins when we do it. Sometimes people think capital vice, oh, that's a mortal sin. The reason why they're the capital vices is because if you give in to one, you're more likely to give in to the others. They sort of, once you let one in, the others kind of rage in. So Thomas says if we go overboard with gluttony, there are some side effects. And he calls it the offspring, kind of just like a mother has offspring. The vices have offsprings too. So there are 5 different offspring of gluttony. And the first one is dull-wittedness. Okay, and this is like, after like everyone eats Thanksgiving dinner, everyone is just like lounged out on the couch, they're stuffed full, and like no one can hold a conversation because everyone's dull-witted, okay? It's not bad to enjoy Thanksgiving, but if you eat too much so that you can't even talk to anyone, that's a problem, right? Another offspring of gluttony is what Thomas calls buffoonery, okay? So this is just like eating too much so you're far too playful. Sometimes some people get like this when they overeat. Another one is the Latin word multiloquium, which means loquaciousness. So sometimes people eat too much and they just won't stop talking. This is also an offspring of gluttony. Another one is called, in Latin, scurrilitas, which means kind of a mischievous playfulness. It's okay to like be playful, but this is like going overboard, kind of playing vicious practical jokes on people. This can be an offspring of gluttony too. And then finally, the last offspring of gluttony is uncleanliness. Okay, we understand that. That's like if you have poor hygiene, you eat too much, that you're spilling all over yourself, that type of thing. And with this one especially, this can often intersect with lust. Okay, and this is what I was saying. Like if you give into one of the vices, the others rush in. So sometimes if you eat way too much, you're more likely to fall in like other sins. One priest told me that someone once told him, he said, "Father, I really struggle with lust," right? Which is like gluttony and lust. So you know how this works, right? So if you indulge too much in one thing, or if you drink too much, you're more inclined to fall in other areas. Okay, gluttony is bad because it leads to selfishness, right? And it leads to ungodliness. Now the remedy to gluttony is what we call abstinence. And abstinence is just the virtue by which we keep our appetites in their proper bounds. Okay? Fasting is a special type of abstinence that we all know about. But fasting involves eating less than one could legitimately eat, but going out. without, but not to the point of injuring your health. That would be bad, because that would be the further extreme, right? So abstinence would be in the middle, gluttony would be like one excess, and then like starvation would be like bad too. Now, when you're fasting, it has to be for a good intention. You just can't be like fasting to look good at the beach, right? It has to be for a spiritual motive, and it also helps control, when you're fasting, you're in control of your body, it helps you control your emotions more. On another level too, it helps you to be in solidarity with those many people, millions of people who go hungry every day. So that's another reason to fast. Another type of abstinence is sobriety. And that's in particular, that's regarding drink, right? Alcoholic drink. And St. Thomas says it's important to keep this in check because alcoholic beverages have kind of a special aptitude to interfere with our reason. And they challenge our ability to regulate our desires. So sobriety would be a type of abstinence too. So the remedies again to gluttony are abstinence and sobriety. Okay, another one I want to talk about, a vice, and the contrary virtue is lust, and then the contrary virtue would be chastity. All right, so chastity would be the temperate virtue. What's lust? It's the selfish pursuit of sensual gratification. And I think we know that lust is also something that when we give into and indulge, we feel very shameful afterwards. And that's because, when St. Thomas says that's because lust is sort of a lower, baser desire. And if we let ourselves be overtaken by that, it can sort of eclipse our reason. And therefore, God gave us this reason, but we're letting it be eclipsed by a lower desire, and we're acting on these lower desires. And so afterwards, we feel very shameful about that, and that's partly why. Okay, just like there's different offspring of gluttony, there's also offspring of lust, and this is fun too. Different types of imprudence, all right? What's imprudence? It just means being out of control reason, just kind of being out of control. The first type of lust, or the first offspring of lust, or the result of lust, is what's called a precipitousness. St. Thomas uses the word precipitatio. And this is like, it's like the word in English. It's sort of a snowball effect, right? Like, and we know about this. And you see this, songs are about this, you see this in movies, a guy and a girl are together and they, one thing leads to another, it gets hot and heavy and that type of thing. And that's sort of a snowball. And that's the offspring of lust, that you kind of lose control and you let yourself go. Another type of offspring of lust is inconsideratio, which is inconsideration. A better translation would be a recklessness, right? Kind of a reckless lust. So this is like a girls gone wild type of lust, okay? Just kind of like, just totally, being crazy, wild, and, going nuts. Another offspring of lust is inconstancia, which means like an inconstancy or a fickleness. Sometimes you see people just can't control themselves, so they can't stick with one person. They always have to be like, in these, fleeting relationships. That's an offspring of lust. There are other offsprings of lust. Blindness of the mind, okay, or blindness to true human values. Another one is self-absorption or love of self. Another one is hatred of God, odium Dei, or rejection of God. Sometimes you find that in people who are so absorbed with lust, they don't even want to do anything religious, or they can't even stand to be like in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament or something like that. A type of worldliness or a lust of the eyes, that's also an offspring of lust. And then finally, a despair of future life. Sometimes you hear about that, like, oh, why would I want to bring a child into this world, or that type of thing. Sometimes that comes with it's an offspring of lust. The remedy to lust is chastity, right? Chastity means, it comes from the Latin word castigo, which means to discipline. And it was used in in terms of disciplining children or disciplining certain drives. Just like children need discipline. For instance, like if there's a kid, a 5-year-old kid, in line in the grocery store or something, and there's a lady in front of him, the kid, he's not in control of himself, so he just grabs onto the bottom of the lady or something like that, or pushes her, and his mom says, that's bad. You can't follow your desire just to push, the bottom of the lady in front of you. That's like a bad desire that you can't entertain. Likewise, we have to also keep our desires in check. Chastity is a single-minded, single-hearted delight in God and a refraining from pleasures incompatible with that love. So it's a real purity of heart. Sometimes we use the words like chastity and modesty and purity in the same way. They actually mean, what St. Thomas uses them differently. Chastity deals with just sexual activity. Modesty, purity deals with modesty more, like chastity so far in dress, or purity in dress and other areas of our life, conversations, that type of thing. But chastity for Thomas deals just with this, sexual activity. I mentioned that we often feel ashamed when we fall into sins of lust, and that's normal. And this is an inescapable part of lust, but even we experience this in any type of sex. Even for instance, sex between a husband and a wife when they enjoy conjugal love, they do it in the dark, under covers. This is John Paul II actually mentioned this in the Theology of the Body. There's a certain shame involved in sex in general, and it's not because it's bad, but it's because we feel, we feel like we want to be covered, we want to be hidden, and that's a natural impulse, and that's actually good. That what's going on now, you want to be modest, you don't want to do this out in the open, you want to be hidden. That's a natural shame, which is good. And if we also go overboard and do it other ways, we feel that shame too. Now, chastity is needed for all human beings. All of us are called to live chastity. I'm called to live it differently than a husband and a wife. I live chastity by living celibacy. If you're not married, you live chastity by refraining from sexual activity until your marriage. And the husband and wife also can, they have to live chastity too, as well. But all of us are called to it, and it's a great gift from God. And it's a gift, and it's a beautiful thing that God gives us, the gift of sexuality, that we ought to be used well. And when I'm preparing couples for marriage, I always do this inventory called Focus, and it goes through it has all these questions, but one of them is, do I see the gift of sexuality as a gift that God wants me to enjoy? And most of the time, people say no, they disagree with that. I don't think a lot of us understand that sexuality is a great, wonderful gift that God's given to us that ought to be enjoyed, but in a proper way, according to our state in life. Again, lust and then chastity. Finally, I want to talk about anger and then its contrary virtue, which is gentleness or clemency. We see anger all the time in society, right? Sadly, we just heard of this terrible shooting in Denver, how horrific. We see anger in all different ways: road rage, child abuse, domestic violence. It's all over the place. It was once thought that anger could be dissipated by indulging in one's anger. For instance, this idea of if you're angry, just hit a pillow a bunch of times, or I remember one time when I was a freshman in college, I was dating a girl and she broke up with me and I was devastated. So I was really sad, and a friend told me, I went to him I don't know what to do. He's like, just run as fast and as far as you can until you exhaust yourself. This is his advice, I was supposed to do this. But there's this idea if you exhaust yourself physically, maybe you'll exhaust yourself emotionally too, and maybe sort of numb yourself emotionally, okay? This holds no weight, all right? rejected his advice, and I just went on being, you know, devastated. But the way, so that's not the right way to handle anger. I'll talk about how to handle anger later when we talk about gentleness, but this type of behavior, just like hitting a pillow or getting one of those balls you squeeze, that doesn't help you, control your anger, really. St. Thomas asked an interesting question: which is worse, unrestrained anger or unrestrained lust? And he says, look at the outcomes. What's the outcome of unrestrained lust? And it would be probably adultery or fornication. But what's the outcome of unrestrained anger? Murder, right? Or causing someone harm. And murder is worse than adultery. So unrestrained anger is worse than unrestrained lust. But anger is actually, in itself, it's not a bad emotion. And we feel it when we sustain an injury and we have an impulse to strike back. Okay, so it's not bad to feel anger. It's what we do with it. It's okay to feel if you have a good cause to be angry, someone's really offended you, that's okay. But you also have to respond to that appropriately, in a proportionate way, right? So if someone has, offended you in a little way, you can't pretend like, they've, cursed your family name or something, and you can't retaliate on that level. Again, St. Thomas, he lists 3 different types of anger, and this is fun. The first type is acuti, which means, he uses in Latin, this is like someone who's hot-tempered, or someone who has a sharp temper, and a lot of people always say this, I have a really sharp temper. And these people, they're easy, they get angry easy, but then it dissipates easily too. So they get really aggravated, but it tends to quell pretty quickly, almost just as quickly as they get, worked up. So this is one type of anger. This is the least harmful kind. The second is amari. There's an Italian digestivo. It's like an after dinner drink called amaro, and it means bitter. It's sort of a bitter drink, but it helps you digest your food. And that's what it means. Amaro means to be bitter. And we know this type of bitterness, right? It's a type of anger that you're constantly brooding over, you're nursing. This isn't good either. That's not healthy. The worst type of anger, however, is something called graves, or grave. So we have a real hardened anger. St. Thomas calls this, these are the hard ones, the people who have an anger that's very hardened. And this is a single-minded intent on revenge. And it's the worst of the vice. It's worse because you can't always detect it. The person isn't, they may not have a hot temper, but within they have this desire for revenge that can only be achieved in retaliation. So those are the 3 types of anger. And then there's offspring of anger. The first is indignatio, or an indignation. And this is despising or demonizing your opponent. So sometimes, if you're angry with someone, and we all do this, we pretend in our minds that they're a lot worse than they are, and we build up this image of them, and that's indignatio. Another offspring of anger is the Latin word tumor mentis. It's like a tumor. So it's a swelling of the mind. This happens to me. I don't know about you, but sometimes if something happens to you, someone offends you, your mind starts racing, and you can't you just think, well, how am I? I don't believe that person can offend me. That's a type of swelling of the mind. That's an offspring of anger. A final and the worst offspring of anger is violent strife, which can be physical, and that's the worst. Okay, what are the remedies to anger? The remedies are owning up to it and embracing it, and not nurturing it, trying to deconstruct it. So we do this just by systematically thinking, okay, carefully going, counting to 10 even, or thinking, well, why do I feel offended? Let me try to walk back. A way of processing our grief that's very helpful. Exploring our emotions instead of in trying to get at the real wound. Okay, the contrary virtue to anger is gentleness or clemency. And gentleness is just the virtue by which we moderate our anger. And that if we're gentle, we don't get angry without a good cause, okay? And then clemency, and then if there is a good cause, we don't go in excess in wanting to retaliate, okay? So the retaliation is proportionate to the offense. Clemency is the desire to mitigate the punishment or your retaliation as much as possible. So sometimes you hear, that person's so clement. It means that they're merciful. Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will see God." Finally, so that's just the heart of my talk. These contrary virtues and vices. I want to close with humility, because St. Thomas says that humility is a secondary virtue of temperance. So if we're humble, it helps us to be temperate. Humility is a virtue of self-restraint, and it means being like of the earth. It means like humus means dust. So humility means being earthbound and like really tied to the earth, understanding who you are, your limitations, your dependency on God. It's a well-moderated self-esteem. So it's not, being humble isn't letting people walk over you. It's not being a doormat, but it's understanding who you are in relationship to God. And this really helps us in temperance because it gives us a sense of self-knowledge. If you're humble, you know yourself. You don't try to go after things greater than you. You don't let people, you don't let people disrespect you. You just know where you are and where you stand. This is also very helpful for temperance because if you're humble and you know yourself, you know what sins you're inclined to fall into, right? And you know like the patterns of the sins that affect you. And if you know the pattern, and like I have an inclination to, if I drink too much, then I'm probably going to get carried away. I could get angry or whatever. The humble person recognizes that, they know that, and then they try to counteract it. Okay, so a great virtue to increase and to ask God to give you is humility. This is the end of my talk. I just want to close with that. And I want to close with a little anecdote of Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, who one time when he displayed the virtue of temperance, once he lived in Italy, this was probably around 1920, and the society was still pretty modest, but he was once passing by like a newspaper stand, and they had some like immodest pictures, like just how today they have immodest pictures or some magazines or some print that had an indecently clad woman. And young Frassati, probably 20 years old or 21 or 22, went up to the owner and he said, you should cover that up. That's not an appropriate thing to have visible because children can see this and it's not helping anyone live the virtue of chastity. So let's today, especially when we pray before our Lord, ask for this virtue of temperance. It's one of the great virtues that God gives us, one of the capital virtues, and it's a gift from God. We can nurture some of these human virtues, like associated with it, but to really have it and live it well and easily, we have to ask God for that gift. So among our many intentions today, we'll pray for an increase in the virtue of temperance.